They thought it was just another viral clip. A waitress, a fallen plate, a powerful woman humiliated in public. What the video didn't show was who was watching. In a dark room miles away, a man paused the footage at the exact moment the waitress lifted her chin instead of bowing her head. No fear, no apology, just defiance, the kind that gets people erased or elevated. The woman in the video had no idea her life had already been marked for change. No idea that the surname she had just offended ruled half the city from the shadows. No idea that by choosing dignity over survival, she had caught the attention of a man who never forgave and never forgot. This wasn't a story about a plate thrown in anger. It was the moment a powerless woman stepped onto the path of a mafia empire, and the only man who could destroy her decided not to. Because some defiance is too rare to crush. Grace Mitchell stepped into her evening shift at Monarch with a faint, unwelcome unease clinging to her skin. It wasn't fear exactly, more like the quiet instinct one develops after years of surviving on the edge of collapse. The restaurant glowed the way it always did at night, all polished marble, warm amber lights, and the low murmur of money pretending to be manners. Grace adjusted her uniform, smoothed an invisible crease at her waist, and reminded herself to breathe. 7 years. That was how long Monarch had been her battlefield and her shelter. 7 years of learning how to smile without meaning it, how to apologize without fault, how to disappear just enough to keep her job. Tonight should have been no different. But then the manager pulled her aside. "A VIP table?" he said in a hushed tone. "Last-minute reservation. Absolute privacy. No mistakes. No mistakes." The phrase landed heavier than it should have. Grace nodded, because that was what she always did. She didn't ask who the guest was. Names at Monarch rarely mattered to the staff. Only the power attached to them did. She carried the menus herself, heart steady, posture perfect. When she reached the private dining section and drew back the curtain, the air shifted. The woman seated at the table looked up slowly, as though she had been expecting Grace all along. Eleanor Blackwood? The name meant nothing to Grace in that first heartbeat. It would soon mean everything. Eleanor was elegant in a way that felt deliberate rather than natural silver hair pinned immaculately, posture straight, eyes sharp with a kind of intelligence that did not seek warmth. She didn't smile. She examined Grace the way one might examine a flawed diamond, turning her over mentally, assessing where pressure would cause the most damage. Grace felt it immediately. This woman was not looking at her as a person. She was looking at her as a test. "Good evening," Grace said smoothly, her voice calm from years of practice. "Welcome to Monarch." Eleanor's lips curved slightly, not a smile, something colder. "So," the woman said, her voice soft and precise. "Your Grace." The word hit like a glass shattering quietly inside Grace's chest. She did not let it show. "Yes, ma'am," Grace replied, though her pulse had begun to race. "I'll be taking care of you this evening." Eleanor tilted her head, studying her more closely now, as if savoring the reaction she hadn't yet seen. "I expect nothing less." Grace Mitchell. That was the twist. Small, surgical, devastating. They had never met. Grace had never introduced herself. For a fraction of a second, the room seemed to tilt. Grace's mind searched desperately for explanations. Perhaps the manager had mentioned her name. Perhaps it was written somewhere she hadn't noticed. But instinct whispered a darker truth. This woman had come prepared. Eleanor had known exactly who would be serving her. From that moment on, the evening became a slow, deliberate unraveling. The menu was criticized first. Too limited, too ambitious. The wine selection was questioned next, then dismissed outright. Each request contradicted the last. Each instruction arrived with an expectant pause. As though Eleanor were waiting for Grace to fail. Grace did not fail. She adjusted, corrected, apologized when required, and stayed silent when silence was safer. Her hands remained steady, even as the scrutiny sharpened. Around them, the restaurant continued to hum, blissfully unaware of the quiet execution unfolding in the private room. "You walk very quietly," Eleanor remarked at one point, watching Grace set down a plate. "It's almost as if you're trying not to exist." Grace smiled faintly. "Years of experience, ma'am." Eleanor's eyes gleamed. Experience has a way of breaking people, or teaching them obedience. The words slid under Grace's skin, cold and invasive. She thought of Noah then, the way she always did when things grew difficult. Her little brother, hunched over textbooks late at night, pretending not to be in pain so she wouldn't worry. Tuition payments, medication refills, rent that never waited. Grace could endure almost anything for him. So she endured this. The criticisms grew sharper. A plate was deemed too warm, then too cold when replaced. The timing was wrong, the presentation uninspired. Eleanor never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her power filled the room without effort. At one point, Grace became aware of the manager lingering just outside the curtain, watching, measuring, choosing his allegiance before the verdict was even delivered. Grace understood then what this truly was. Not a dinner, a demonstration. Eleanor wanted witnesses. When the wine glass tipped just slightly, just enough to spill red across pristine white linen, Grace knew without being told that this, too, would be her fault. Eleanor's hand withdrew calmly, fingers clean, eyes already lifted toward her. The manager stepped forward before Grace could speak. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Blackwood," he said, his gaze sliding past Grace as though she had already ceased to exist. "We'll handle this immediately." The sentence was a blade. The cut clean? Grace apologized because that was the role assigned to her. Her voice remained level even as something inside her cracked. Thin and sharp. Eleanor watched the moment closely and smiled. Not with satisfaction. With approval. Grace lowered her head, but not enough to hide the truth from herself anymore. This woman wasn't seeking an apology. She was seeking surrender. And that, Grace realized, was something she no longer had to give. As she cleared the table, her hands brushed the edge of a porcelain plate. The weight of it felt sudden and real, grounding her in a way fear no longer could. She thought of Noah again, of everything she had sacrificed quietly, of how small she had learned to make herself. Eleanor Blackwood wanted to remind her of her place. Grace straightened instead. The night was far from over, but something irreversible had already begun. Grace Mitchell, the woman who had survived by disappearing, felt the final threads of her invisibility slipping away. She did not yet know what it would cost her. She only knew she would never forget the way Eleanor Blackwood had spoken her name like a promise, or a threat. And somewhere beyond Monarch's glowing walls, a future was shifting its course toward her, unseen and unstoppable. If this story touched your heart, follow the channel to enjoy many more heart-stirring stories every week. The tension did not break after the spilled wine. It thickened, settling into the room like an invisible fog. Grace felt it cling to her skin as she replaced the stained linen, her movements precise, almost mechanical. Years of training kept her expression composed. But inside, her instincts were screaming. Eleanor Blackwood had not come to Monarch for a meal. She had come to watch someone bend. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, observing Grace with renewed interest, as if the small incident had confirmed something she already believed. "You handle embarrassment well," she said lightly. "Most people rush to defend themselves." Grace kept her gaze lowered, neither submissive nor defiant, just controlled. "My priority is your dining experience, ma'am." "Of course it is." Eleanor's eyes flicked briefly toward the manager still hovering nearby, then returned to Grace. "Tell me, Grace, how long have you worked here? 7 years? Eleanor hummed, amused. Loyalty is an undervalued trait these days, or perhaps necessity makes people patient. Grace did not respond. She knew the difference. Patience was a choice. Survival was not. The next dish arrived, placed with deliberate care. Eleanor inspected it as though searching for fault hidden beneath perfection. Her fork hovered, paused, then tapped lightly against the porcelain. "This sauce is heavier than it should be." Grace's chest tightened. "I can have it remade immediately." "No." Eleanor finally tasted it, then set the fork down untouched. "I think I'll keep it. Mistakes should be remembered." The words were soft, almost gentle, but they echoed sharply in Grace's mind. She realized then that Eleanor enjoyed the discomfort, the quiet awareness that every movement was being judged, cataloged, stored away. This was not cruelty born of anger. It was cruelty born of boredom. Grace stepped back, giving space as etiquette demanded, but her awareness sharpened. She noticed how Eleanor's gaze occasionally drifted not to the food, but to Grace's hands, her posture, the subtle tension she tried so hard to hide. It was as if Eleanor were reading a language Grace hadn't known she was speaking. "You have good posture," Eleanor remarked suddenly. "Not the kind learned in service." Grace hesitated for half a second too long. "My mother was strict." "A shame," Eleanor replied calmly. "Strictness often raises people who mistake endurance for strength." The comment landed closer to truth than Grace cared to admit. She thought again of Noah, of the quiet pride he carried, of the way he relied on her without ever saying so. Strength was what kept them afloat. Endurance was what it cost her. As the dinner dragged on, Eleanor's requests grew more exacting. The lighting was too bright, then too dim, the temperature uncomfortable, then cold. Each adjustment satisfied her only briefly before another fault was discovered. The manager complied instantly, casting Grace looks that carried warning rather than support. Grace understood the message clearly. One wrong move, and she would be replaced without a second thought. At one point, Eleanor waved her closer, lowering her voice. "You're very careful," she said. "It makes people trust you. Careful people rarely cause trouble." Grace met her gaze then, just briefly. "I do my job," Eleanor smiled. "That's what everyone says, right before they disappoint me." The implication lingered. Grace felt the slow burn of humiliation rise in her chest, but she swallowed it down. She had learned long ago that pride was expensive. Tonight, she could not afford it. Then Eleanor asked, almost casually, "Is your brother feeling better?" The world narrowed to a single point. Grace froze. "I beg your pardon," she said carefully. Eleanor sipped her water. "Noah? He's quite bright, from what I hear. Science, isn't it?" Grace's heart slammed against her ribs. This was no longer about power in the abstract. This was personal, deliberate, dangerous. She felt suddenly exposed, as though every sacrifice she had made had been laid bare for inspection. "I don't discuss my family with guests," Grace replied, her voice steady only through sheer force of will. Eleanor studied her over the rim of the glass. Wise. Family is a vulnerability most people underestimate. Grace felt something shift then, not in the room, but within herself. Fear sharpened into clarity. Eleanor Blackwood was reminding her of something important that she could be destroyed without ever being touched. And yet, beneath that realization, something else stirred. Anger. Quiet. Controlled. And stubborn. The remainder of the dinner passed in taut silence. Eleanor ate little, criticized much, and observed constantly. When the final course was cleared, she leaned back, appearing satisfied at last. "You may go," she said, dismissing Grace with a flick of her fingers. Grace inclined her head and turned away, her steps measured. It was only when she reached the service corridor that her breath came unevenly. She pressed a hand against the wall, grounding herself. She told herself it was over. She was wrong. Behind her, Eleanor's voice followed softly, precisely. "Grace." Grace turned. Eleanor stood, her silhouette framed by warm light and quiet authority. "I expect better next time." "There won't be a next time," Grace said before she could stop herself. The silence that followed was absolute. Eleanor's expression did not change, but something dangerous flickered in her eyes' interest, sharpened by surprise. "Careful," she said. "People who assume they are replaceable often forget how easily they can disappear." Grace held her gaze. "I haven't forgotten." For a moment, neither woman moved. Then Eleanor smiled slowly, as if Grace had just confirmed something long suspected. She turned back to the table. The conversation ended on her terms. Grace walked away on legs that felt steady only because they had no choice. She did not know what consequences awaited her, only that the line between endurance and defiance had begun to blur, and once crossed, there was no going back. Grace returned to the floor with her composure stitched tightly back into place. Monarch moved around her as it always did, soft footsteps, muted laughter, the discreet choreography of wealth, but something fundamental had shifted. The private dining room no longer felt like a workplace. It felt like a stage, and Eleanor Blackwood was directing every moment with calculated patience. Grace prepared the wine service herself, not because it was required, but because instinct told her to stay close. Distance invited interpretation, and Eleanor Blackwood thrived on interpretation. The bottle was expensive enough to intimidate, the label famous enough to be recognized by those who measured worth in numbers. Grace handled it with steady hands, announcing the year, the region, the notes with professional ease. Eleanor listened without interruption. "Pour," she said. Grace inclined the bottle, watching the dark red stream curve cleanly into the glass. The color was deep, almost velvety. For a moment, just a fraction of a breath, the room was still. Then Eleanor's fingers shifted. The glass tipped. Wine spilled across the tablecloth like a slow wound blooming outward, soaking white linen in a vivid, unmistakable red. The sound was small, insignificant. But Grace felt the impact immediately, sharp and absolute. Time slowed. Grace straightened instinctively, already opening her mouth to apologize, to take responsibility, to offer solutions. But Eleanor had already leaned back, her expression one of mild surprise, carefully rehearsed. "How careless," Eleanor said, softly. The manager appeared at Grace's side, as if summoned by an invisible thread. "I'm terribly sorry, Mrs. Blackwood," he said quickly. "We'll address this immediately." Grace felt the weight of his words settle squarely on her shoulders. He did not ask what had happened. He did not look at the glass, or the angle of Eleanor's hand. The decision had been made before the wine ever touched the tablecloth. "I'm so sorry," Grace said. The words automatic, though something inside her resisted them now. "I'll replace the linen at once." Eleanor watched her closely, eyes sharp with anticipation. Grace moved to clean the table, her movements controlled, her breath measured. She had survived worse than humiliation. She had endured longer nights, colder silences. This was a moment. It would pass. But Eleanor was not finished. "You know," she said idly, "people often reveal their true character when they're accused of something they didn't do." Grace paused. The room felt suddenly smaller. "I believe accountability matters," Grace replied carefully. Eleanor smiled. "So do I. Especially when it's deserved." The manager cleared his throat. "We'll take care of this," he repeated, this time to Grace. The implication was clear. Step back. Be quiet. Disappear. Grace looked at the stained linen, at the wine soaking deeper into the fabric, at Eleanor's perfectly clean hands, and something inside her finally reached its limit. It was not rage. Rage was loud, reckless, easy to dismiss. What rose in Grace was quieter, sharper, a realization that settled with devastating calm. This would never end, no matter how carefully she spoke, how low she bowed, how perfectly she served. Eleanor Blackwood would continue, because this was not about a mistake. It was about proving that Grace Mitchell could be broken in public and no one would object. Grace straightened slowly. The silence that followed was immediate and heavy. "I apologize for the inconvenience," Grace said, her voice level. "Clear enough to carry." But I did not spill the wine. The manager turned sharply. Grace Eleanor lifted a hand, stopping him. For the first time that night, genuine interest flickered across her features. "Is that so?" "Yes." Grace met her gaze fully now. "It tipped when you moved your hand." The words were not loud. They did not accuse. They simply existed, undeniable once spoken. Around them, the low murmur of the restaurant faltered. Nearby guests pretended not to listen, curiosity thinly veiled beneath polite indifference. Power shifted subtly in the room, like air before a storm. Eleanor studied Grace in silence. Seconds stretched. Grace felt her heartbeat in her ears, but she did not look away. She thought of Noah, not his need this time, but his faith in her. The quiet assumption that she would always stand back up. Eleanor's lips curved. "Well," she said calmly, "that's an interesting version of events." The manager's face had gone pale. "Grace, I suggest you—" Grace cut a glance toward him, just long enough to make her meaning clear. She would not retract it. Eleanor rose from her chair. She was not tall, but she commanded the space effortlessly, presence radiating outward like pressure. She stepped closer to the table, close enough that Grace could smell her perfume, something subtle, expensive, and cold. "Do you know," Eleanor said softly. How many people have stood where you are now and thought honesty would protect them? Grace did not answer. Eleanor's gaze dropped briefly to the plate resting in Grace's hands, the untouched entree. Still warm, still pristine. Then her eyes lifted again. Locking onto Grace's, I admire courage, Eleanor continued. I simply find it inconvenient. Grace felt the room hold its breath. She did not know why her hands moved when they did. Perhaps it was instinct. Perhaps it was exhaustion. Perhaps it was the sudden, overwhelming understanding that there were moments when survival demanded more than silence. The plate tipped. The food slid free, landing squarely against Eleanor's immaculate dress. The sound was louder than the wine, a soft, unmistakable slap, followed by stunned silence. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Grace stood very still, the empty plate balanced calmly in her hands. She did not gasp, she did not flinch. Her expression held no triumph, no apology, only acceptance. I believe, Grace said quietly. This sieves are finished. Chaos erupted around them. Gasps, hurried footsteps, raised voices. The manager shouted her name. Disbelief and fury tangled together. Guests stared openly now, etiquette forgotten. Eleanor looked down at herself slowly. Then she looked back at Grace. Something unreadable passed between them. Grace did not run. She set the plate down carefully, squared her shoulders, and met whatever would come next head on. For the first time in her life, Grace Mitchell did not feel invisible. And for Eleanor Blackwood, that may have been the greater offense. Silence fell hard after the plate hit the floor. It was not the dramatic kind, not the kind filled with gasps and shouts that came later. This silence was heavier, dense, the kind that pressed against the chest and made even breathing feel like a decision. Grace stood exactly where she was, hands empty now, posture straight, eyes steady. She did not look at the food on Eleanor Blackwood's dress. She did not look away either. Eleanor was the first to move. Slowly, deliberately. She lifted her gaze from the ruined silk and met Grace's eyes. There was no scream, no outrage, no demand, only a long, measuring look, as though Eleanor were reassessing a familiar object that had suddenly behaved in an unfamiliar way. Around them, monarchs seemed to awaken all at once. Chairs scraped. Whispers broke free. Someone laughed nervously, then stopped. The manager rushed forward, his face drained of color. Grace Mitchell, he said sharply, her full name cracking like a verdict. What do you think you're doing? Grace turned to him calmly. Ending my shift. The words landed with unsettling clarity. Eleanor's brow lifted slightly. Interest, not anger, flickered across her face. Is that what this is? She asked. An exit Grace did not answer immediately. She felt strangely light, as though the moment she had crossed the line, the weight she had carried for years had finally slipped from her shoulders. Fear was still there, coiled tight, but it no longer ruled her movements. I won't apologize for something I chose, Grace said at last. The manager looked as if she had struck him. You're fired, he snapped, the decision tumbling out too fast, too loud, effective immediately. Security. That won't be necessary, Eleanor interrupted softly. Every head turned. Eleanor adjusted the ruined fabric of her dress with unhurried grace, as though the mess were a minor inconvenience rather than a public affront. I believe, she continued, that Miss Mitchell has already made her intentions clear. Her gaze returned to Grace. You've made a rather theatrical choice. Grace met her eyes without flinching. It felt honest. Eleanor smiled faintly. Honesty has consequences. I know. For a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or the quiet acknowledgement of two women who understood the cost of power, even if they wielded it differently. Eleanor turned away first. I've lost my appetite, she announced. See that my things are handled properly. The manager scrambled to comply, nodding too quickly, too deeply. Eleanor walked past Grace without another glance, her presence receding but not diminishing. The room exhaled only after she disappeared behind the curtain. Grace felt the absence immediately. The manager rounded on her. Do you have any idea what you've done? He hissed. Do you know who she is? Grace nodded once. Enough. You'll never work in this city again. He continued. his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and fear. "Do you hear me?" "Never." Grace heard him. She simply no longer obeyed. She removed her apron slowly, folding it with care, as though it were not a symbol of years spent shrinking herself to fit someone else's comfort. She placed it neatly on the service counter. "I'll collect my things," she said. No one stopped her. The walk through Monarch felt unreal. Conversations halted as she passed. Some faces held shock, others pity. A few something like admiration quickly smothered by caution. Grace did not rush. She did not lower her head. Each step felt deliberate, earned. In the locker room, she changed quietly, hands trembling only when she reached for her coat. She pressed her palm against the metal door for a moment, steadying herself. The future loomed large and terrifying, but it was hers again. Outside, the night air hit her like cold water. Grace stepped onto the sidewalk and finally allowed herself to breathe. The city moved around her, indifferent and alive. Cars passed. Laughter drifted from a nearby bar. Monarch's golden light spilled onto the pavement behind her, warm and unreachable. Her phone buzzed. Noah. She hesitated before answering, dread and relief tangling together. "Hey," she said softly. "Grace," Noah replied, his voice tight. "Are you okay?" She closed her eyes briefly. "I will be." He didn't push. He never did. "I saw the video," so it had already begun. Grace leaned against the cool stone wall, staring up at the dark sky. "I didn't mean for you to see it like that." "I'm glad I did," Noah said quietly. "I didn't know they treated you like that." Grace swallowed. "I didn't want you to worry." "I worry anyway," he replied. Then, after a pause, "I'm proud of you." The words hit harder than anything that night. Grace felt tears rise at last, hot and sudden. She laughed softly, the sound shaky but real. "That makes one of us." After the call ended, Grace slipped her phone into her pocket and straightened. She did not know where she would work next. She did not know how long her savings would last. She did know that somewhere, consequences were already moving toward her, shaped by a name she had dared to challenge, high above the city, in a place far removed from Monarch's polite chaos. A man watched the same video again. He paused it at the moment Grace stood still, unbowed, facing a storm she could not see. Nathaniel Blackwood leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, expression unreadable. She didn't run. He murmured. For the first time in a long while, something like curiosity stirred. Grace Mitchell walked away from Monarch believing she had lost everything. She did not yet know she had just been noticed by the one person who could make that loss irreversible or turn it into something far more dangerous. Grace slept poorly that night, drifting in and out of shallow dreams where white tablecloths bled red and unfamiliar eyes followed her wherever she turned. When morning came, it arrived without mercy. Light crept through thin curtains, illuminating a reality that felt heavier now that the adrenaline had faded. Her phone was already buzzing. Messages, missed calls, notifications stacked one after another until the screen looked crowded, almost accusing. Grace stared at it for a long moment before gathering the courage to look. The video had spread far beyond Monarch. Clips edited, slowed down, replayed from different angles. Captions argued over the truth with the confidence of strangers who had never stood in that room. Some called her brave, others reckless, many cruel. Grace set the phone aside and focused on making breakfast, hands steady out of habit. Noah emerged from his room quietly, eyes tired but alert. He didn't speak at first. He just watched her move around the small kitchen, noting what she didn't say. "You don't have to pretend," he said gently. Grace paused, then smiled at him. "I'm not." It wasn't entirely true, but Noah accepted it anyway. He always did, after he left for class. Grace finally allowed herself to sit. The silence pressed in, louder than any noise from the night before. Monarch was gone. 7 years reduced to a folded apron and a final paycheck that would barely last a month. Fear crept closer now, whispering numbers, deadlines, consequences. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email. "Thank you for your interest." Unfortunately. She closed it before finishing. Then another arrived. And another. Grace hadn't even applied yet, but word traveled fast in their world. Hospitality was smaller than it pretended to be, bound together by whispered warnings and unspoken rules. She tried anyway. By noon, she had sent out resumes to every restaurant within reasonable distance. By evening, the replies began arriving polite, distant, identical. Positions suddenly filled. Interviews postponed indefinitely. Silence where interest should have been. Grace leaned back in her chair, exhaustion settling deep into her bones. This was Eleanor Blackwood's doing. Not loudly, not publicly, just a quiet closing of doors. She expected anger. What surprised her was the calm. There was a strange clarity in knowing the source of the storm. Later that night, Grace went for a walk. The city felt different now, as though she were seeing it without the protective blur of routine. People passed her without recognition, unaware that her face had been watched by millions only hours earlier. Fame, she realized, was just another illusion, loud, fleeting, and ultimately hollow. She stopped at a small cafe she used to visit years ago, back when life had been simpler. The owner recognized her instantly, eyes widening with something like concern. "I saw the video," the woman said quietly. "I'm sorry." Grace nodded. "Me too." They talked for a few minutes, nothing important, nothing dangerous. When Grace left, she felt lighter for reasons she couldn't fully explain. Perhaps it was the reminder that kindness still existed beyond power's reach. That night, Noah found her at the kitchen table, papers spread out before her. "You're planning," he said. Grace smiled faintly. "I don't know how to do anything else." He hesitated. "We'll manage." She looked up at him. Really looked. He was growing older, sharper, more aware. The thought filled her with equal parts pride and sorrow. "I won't let this touch you," she said firmly. Noah met her gaze. "You already did something for me. You showed me what it looks like not to disappear." The words settled between them, heavy and warm, across the city, in an office where silence was a currency. Nathaniel Blackwood closed his laptop. He had watched the video again, not the edited versions, but the original. He had slowed it down, studied the moment when Grace stood still instead of stepping back. He wasn't interested in the humiliation. He was interested in the restraint. "She chose consequence," he murmured to the empty room. A subordinate hovered nearby, careful not to speak unless invited. "Mrs. Blackwood has expressed dissatisfaction," the man said finally. Nathaniel's expression did not change. She often does. And the woman, Nathaniel paused. "Leave her alone." The order hung in the air, quiet but absolute. Back in her apartment, Grace lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The applause had faded. The outrage, too. What remained was the slow, grinding reality of survival without invisibility. She did not regret what she had done. But she understood now that courage was not a single moment. It was the long aftermath, the days when no one was watching, the nights when doubt crept in and demanded answers she didn't have. Grace closed her eyes and breathed. Somewhere beyond her sight, forces were shifting, some against her, some inexplicably holding back. She stood at the edge of something vast and unseen, unaware that the most dangerous part of her story was only beginning, and for the first time since she left Monarch. Grace Mitchell allowed herself to feel it, not fear, anticipation. The city moved on faster than Grace expected. By the third day, the video had slipped from the top of trending lists, replaced by newer scandals, louder outrage. Public attention, she learned, had the lifespan of a spark. What remained was quieter and far more damaging. Reputation. Grace felt it everywhere in the pauses that followed her name, in the way conversations ended abruptly when she entered a room, in the emails that never arrived. Restaurants she had once dreamed of working in stopped replying altogether. Others sent brief, courteous rejections that said nothing and implied everything. "She's difficult. She's a risk. She doesn't know her place." The words weren't written anywhere. They didn't need to be. Grace adjusted her routine with practical efficiency. She cut unnecessary expenses, canceled small comforts, recalculated timelines. Her savings shrank under the weight of rent and bills, numbers marching toward an edge she refused to look at too closely. Each morning, she woke before dawn, dressed neatly, and left the apartment with resumes she already suspected were useless. Noah noticed the changes even when she tried to hide them. The fridge grew emptier. The lights stayed off longer in the evenings. Grace brushed off his concern with soft smiles and careful lies. "I'll figure it out," she said. She always did. But the city was patient. It knew how to wait. One afternoon, Grace stood in line at a modest restaurant that had advertised a server opening. The manager greeted her politely, too politely. His smile faltered the moment he scanned her resume. "You have excellent experience," he said slowly. Grace nodded, hopeful despite herself. He hesitated. "But I'm afraid this position has already been filled." She thanked him anyway. When she turned to leave, she caught the reflection of her own face in the glass. Calm, composed, exhausted, she wondered how many doors would close before she stopped knocking. That night, she dreamed of Monarch again. This time, the dining room was empty. Table after table sat untouched, pristine, waiting. She walked through them calling her own name, but no one answered. She woke with her heart racing. Across the city, Nathaniel Blackwood sat in a quiet meeting room, listening more than speaking. The men around him discussed logistics, profits, territories. He absorbed it all without comment. His attention split between numbers on a screen and something less tangible. "Restaurants are being cautious," one of them remarked. Word spreads. Nathaniel's gaze lifted slightly. "Caution can become cowardice." The room stilled. No one instructed them to act. The man added carefully. Nathaniel closed the file in front of him. "That's the problem." He said nothing more, but the meeting ended soon after. Orders were never loud. They didn't need to be. Grace felt the shift before she understood it. A restaurant she had applied to weeks earlier called unexpectedly. The manager sounded uncertain, almost reluctant. "We're reconsidering," he said. "If you're still available." Grace thanked him and set up an interview. Heart-pounding. For the first time in days, hope flared bright enough to hurt. The interview went well. Too well. The manager asked few questions, avoided her eyes, and offered vague assurances. Grace left with mixed emotions, unable to tell whether this was progress or another carefully staged delay. When the offer never came, disappointment settled quietly, without drama. That evening, Grace returned home to find Noah studying harder than usual, jaw set in concentration. He glanced up when she entered, searching her face. "Anything he asked?" She shook her head. "Not yet." He nodded, accepting it with a maturity that made her chest ache. "Then we wait." Grace forced a smile. "Then we wait." Later, alone in her room, she allowed herself a rare moment of doubt. What if this was it? What if standing her ground had cost her more than she could afford? The city didn't reward defiance. It punished it, slowly, methodically. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Grace stared at the screen, pulse quickening. She almost didn't answer. "Hello?" Silence met her at first, then a voice low, controlled, unfamiliar. "Miss Mitchell, this call is not a threat." Her grip tightened. "Then what is it?" "A courtesy," the voice replied. "You're being excluded from opportunities you're qualified for." "I know," Grace said flatly. "There are ways to correct that," the voice continued. "Paths that would make your life easier." Grace closed her eyes. "I'm not interested." A pause. "You haven't heard the offer." "I don't need to," she replied. "Anything that comes with strings isn't help. It's leverage." Another silence. Longer this time. "I'll pass that along," the voice said finally, something like respect threading through it. The call ended. Grace sat there for a long moment, heart pounding. She didn't know who had called. She only knew one thing. They were watching her. High above the city, Nathaniel Blackwood stood by the window of his office, looking down at streets that obeyed rules he had long mastered. His phone rested silent in his hand. She refused. The voice had reported. Nathaniel's mouth curved slightly. Of course she did. Most people would have begged, bargained, bent. Grace Mitchell did none of those things. He set the phone down and returned his gaze to the city. Somewhere within it, A woman was standing alone against forces she couldn't see, refusing to move out of the way. Nathaniel found that compelling. Back in her apartment, Grace lay awake, staring into the dark. She felt the pressure closing in, the city's quiet rejection tightening its grip. Yet beneath the fear, something else remained. Resolve. If the city wanted her gone, it would have to do more than whisper. Grace Mitchell had already disappeared once in her life. She would not do it again. Grace sensed the change before she could name it. The city had stopped pushing. The pressure that once felt constant emails unanswered, doors quietly closing, conversations ending before they began, did not disappear. But it loosened. Not enough to be relief, enough to be unsettling. Like a hand withdrawn not out of mercy, but calculation. She noticed it in small ways. A recruiter who finally replied, though without commitment. A restaurant manager who agreed to meet her for coffee instead of dismissing her outright. People still hesitated when they recognized her, but the outright rejection had softened into something less absolute. Grace did not trust it. She had learned that silence could be more dangerous than noise. Meanwhile, somewhere far above the city's ordinary rhythms, Nathaniel Blackwood watched the aftermath unfold with the patience of someone accustomed to seeing patterns others missed. He had instructed nothing further. That restraint, too, was intentional. Grace Mitchell was most revealing when she believed she was alone. He reviewed reports without comment, skimming past data that bored him. Numbers had always been obedient. People were not. And Grace was an anomaly. She's still refusing assistance. One of his aides reported carefully. Nathaniel's eyes remained on the screen. Good. The aide hesitated. Good. For her. For me. Nathaniel replied, closing the file. He remembered the first time he had paused the video, the moment when Grace stood still instead of retreating. It had reminded him of something uncomfortably familiar, a younger version of himself. Before obedience became currency and fear became useful, before power demanded sacrifices he could no longer pretend were optional. Grace didn't know the rules, or perhaps she did, and chose to ignore them anyway. That was rarer. Grace's days settled into a new rhythm, quieter, more constrained. She took temporary work where she could find it short shifts, under-the-table pay, jobs that ended before questions could be asked. Pride learned to wait. Necessity did not. Each night, she returned home with sore feet and a tired smile she reserved for Noah alone. You don't have to do all of this, he said one evening, watching her sort through bills. I do, Grace replied simply. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. Then I'll make it worth it. The promise lingered long after he returned to his room. Grace went to bed that night thinking not of exhaustion, but of the strange, persistent feeling that someone was measuring her from afar, not judging, assessing. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it sharpened her focus. The invitation came 2 days later. It arrived without drama, no letterhead, no signature, no obvious threat. Just a card slipped beneath her apartment door. Thick paper, minimal text. A private meeting, one conversation, no obligations. An address followed. A time. Grace stared at the card for a long moment, pulse steady, mind racing. She showed it to Noah, watching his expression tighten. You don't have to go, he said immediately. I know, Grace replied. But if I don't, she said slowly, I'll always wonder what happens when you stop running. She did not tell him the name that had already formed in her mind. The building was discreet, unmarked, its entrance guarded by silence rather than force. Grace arrived exactly on time, coat buttoned tight, posture calm. No one stopped her. No one greeted her either. She was led through corridors that spoke of wealth without display, control without noise. The room she entered was spacious and spare. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, distant and small. A man stood with his back to her, hands clasped loosely behind him. Nathaniel Blackwood did not turn right away. You came, he said, voice even. I don't like unanswered questions, Grace replied. That earned a faint smile. He turned then, and Grace felt the impact immediately, not fear, not awe, but awareness. This was a man accustomed to being the axis around which decisions rotated. His presence did not demand attention. It assumed it. You refused help, Nathaniel said, studying her openly now. Most people don't. Most help isn't free, Grace replied. Nothing is. He agreed. They regarded each other in silence, a quiet standoff layered with unspoken truths. Grace noticed the details, the stillness in his posture, the restraint in his gaze. This man did not rush. He waited. That, she suspected, was what made him dangerous. You're not here to threaten me, Grace said. Nathaniel inclined his head slightly. Correct. Then why am I here because you stood still? He replied. And the city noticed. I noticed. Grace crossed her arms loosely, grounding herself. Standing still doesn't mean standing with you. I wouldn't expect it to, he said calmly. Alignment is earned. The honesty unsettled her more than any veiled warning could have. I won't belong to anyone. Grace said. Nathaniel's eyes darkened, not with anger, but interest. Neither do I. For a moment, the world beyond the windows seemed to fall away. Two people, neither willing to bend, measuring the distance between power and principle. This isn't an offer, Nathaniel continued. It's a conversation, one you can walk away from. Grace studied him carefully. And if I do, then nothing changes, he said. For now. Grace exhaled slowly. She had expected manipulation, pressure, coercion. Instead, she found something more unsettling, a man who respected boundaries because he understood their value. I'll listen, she said at last. Nathaniel nodded, as though he had anticipated that answer all along. Outside, the city continued its restless churn, unaware that two opposing forces had just acknowledged each other for the first time. Grace Mitchell had not stepped into Nathaniel Blackwood's world, but she was standing close enough now to see its edges. And Nathaniel, watching her with measured restraint, knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was not like the others. Grace left the building without a promise, without a bargain, and without the relief she had expected. The conversation with Nathaniel Blackwood lingered like a held breath unfinished. Deliberate. He had not offered her protection. She had not asked for it. And yet the city outside felt subtly altered, as though some invisible boundary had been redrawn. She walked for several blocks before hailing a cab, needing the movement to settle her thoughts. Nathaniel's words replayed in her mind, not because they were threatening, but because they were precise. He had not tried to own her choice. He had simply placed it in front of her and stepped back. That, Grace realized, was the most dangerous kind of power. At home, Noah listened quietly as she described the meeting in careful fragments. She left out the way Nathaniel's gaze had sharpened when she refused to bend, the strange warmth that followed tension rather than dissolving it. Are you safe? Noah asked. Yes, Grace replied honestly. For now, Grace hesitated, then nodded. For now. Across the city, Eleanor Blackwood sat in a room designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure. News traveled fast within her circles, faster still, when filtered through whispers sharpened by offense. You met her, Eleanor said coolly, eyes fixed on her son. The waitress? Nathaniel did not bother denying it. Her name is Grace. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. I didn't raise you to involve yourself in trivialities. Nathaniel met her gaze, unflinching. You raised me to recognize leverage, and to know when not to use it. Eleanor rose slowly from her chair. She humiliated me. She refused to be humiliated, Nathaniel corrected. The distinction hung between them, heavy with meaning. Eleanor's eyes hardened. You think this is about her? This is about precedent. If people believe they can defy us publicly, they'll test the limits. Nathaniel finished calmly. Yes, that cannot be allowed. Nathaniel stepped closer, his voice lowering. It already has been. By you. The silence that followed was brittle, dangerous. Eleanor had never tolerated defiance, not from enemies, not from allies, and certainly not from her own son. Yet there was something in Nathaniel's expression that gave her pause. You're choosing a stranger over your family, she said softly. No, Nathaniel replied. I'm choosing a boundary. Eleanor laughed quietly. Since when do you care about boundaries? Since I learned what happens when they're erased. For a moment, Something flickered across Eleanor's face, recognition. Perhaps, or regret, quickly buried. She will learn her place, she said finally. With or without your interference. Nathaniel's voice turned cold. She will not be touched. The words were not raised. They did not need to be. Power, when absolute, was often almost gentle. Eleanor studied him for a long moment. You'd risk internal conflict over a woman who means nothing to you. Nathaniel did not answer immediately. When he did, his tone was measured. She means nothing to our empire. That's the point. Eleanor's gaze sharpened. Careful. Nathaniel, lines drawn for others can be crossed from either side. Not this one, he said simply. Grace felt the tension without understanding its source. The days that followed were oddly calm, too calm. Applications stalled, but rejections ceased. Temporary work continued to come through, just enough to keep her afloat. It was as if someone had placed a hand between her and the worst of the fall. She did not thank anyone. She focused on Noah, on routine, on maintaining the fragile independence she refused to trade away. Yet at night, when the apartment fell quiet, her thoughts returned to the man who had watched her without interfering and then drawn a line she had never asked for. One evening, she received a message. No number, no name. You are not obligated to respond. But you should know some storms are not accidents. Grace stared at the screen, pulse steady. She typed a reply, then erased it. Typed again. I don't need shelter. She finally sent, I need space. The response came almost immediately. Then space is what you'll have. Grace exhaled slowly, unsure whether she had just secured her freedom or stepped deeper into something she did not yet understand. High above the city, Nathaniel stood by the window once more, phone in hand. He read her message twice, then allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile. She was still pushing back. Good, because lines that mattered were rarely drawn by one side alone. And somewhere between restraint and inevitability, Grace Mitchell and Nathaniel Blackwood were approaching a point where distance would no longer be possible. The calm did not last. Grace had learned to recognize that particular silence. The kind that arrives not as peace, but as preparation. The city's restraint felt intentional now, like a pause before something heavier was set in motion. Work became irregular again. Calls stopped coming. The small balance she had carefully maintained began to erode faster than she expected. She sat at the kitchen table one evening, bills spread before her, pen unmoving in her hand. The numbers refused to change no matter how long she stared at them. Rent loomed closest, merciless and fixed. Noah's tuition followed close behind, a quieter threat but no less real. She exhaled slowly and folded the papers away. That night, Grace made a decision she had been avoiding for weeks. The apartment had never been much, but it was theirs, a place patched together with effort and small victories. She walked through it quietly, touching the edges of furniture. The framed photo of her and Noah from years ago, the worn couch where he had fallen asleep studying more times than she could count. She listed the apartment the next morning. The act felt like betrayal and relief in equal measure. Noah noticed immediately. You're serious, he said, voice low. I don't have a choice. Grace replied. You always have a choice. Grace met his gaze. Not when the consequences fall on you. The words ended the argument before it could begin. Days passed in a blur of showings and careful conversations. Potential buyers walked through the apartment with polite interest, unaware of the weight each step carried. Grace answered questions calmly, detached from the outcome even as it pressed closer. At night, doubt crept in. Not regret, she did not regret standing her ground, but exhaustion. She wondered how many more lines she could hold before there was nothing left to draw. Across the city, Nathaniel Blackwood watched the shift with a narrowing gaze. She's selling, one of his aides reported quietly. Nathaniel said nothing at first. He leaned back in his chair, eyes unfocused, considering the implications. Selling the apartment was not defiance. It was sacrifice. And sacrifice, he knew well, was the most dangerous kind of resolve. That wasn't supposed to happen. The aide added carefully. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. No, it wasn't. He dismissed the room with a gesture and stood alone by the window. The city stretched out below him, obedient and indifferent. He had promised Grace space. He had meant it. But space, he realized, could still be lethal when left unattended. Grace stood at the brink, now not dramatic, not loud, just quiet erosion, and the city would take everything from her if allowed. Nathaniel reached for his phone, then stopped. Intervention would change everything. That evening, Grace received an offer on the apartment. Lower than market value, fast closing, no complications. She knew what it was the moment she read it. Pressure, disguised as opportunity. She declined. Her phone rang minutes later. "Unknown number again. I told you I don't need leverage," Grace said without greeting. The voice on the other end paused. "You're approaching a point where independence becomes self-destruction. That's my decision." Grace replied, "Not if others pay the price." Grace closed her eyes. "Noah, always Noah. I won't let him," she said quietly. "That's what concerns us." Grace's grip tightened. "Then you should stop pretending this is about help." The call ended without farewell. Later that night, Noah found her sitting in the dark, lights off, shoulders tense. "You're scared," he said gently. Grace didn't deny it. "I'm tired." He sat across from her. "Then let me help." She shook her head. "This isn't yours to carry." "It already is," Noah replied. "You made sure of that the day you chose not to disappear." The words struck deep. Grace swallowed hard. "I just wanted you safe." "I am," he said firmly. "Because of you." Grace looked away, the ache in her chest sharp and unrelenting. She had stood still once, and the cost was unfolding slowly now, measured in losses rather than applause. Across the city, Nathaniel made his decision, not as a Blackwood, not as an heir, but as a man who understood what happened when resolve met isolation. He did not call Grace. Instead, he moved quietly. The offer on the apartment vanished. The buyer withdrew without explanation. A new listing opportunity appeared, higher value, longer timeline, less pressure. No fingerprints, no demands. Grace noticed immediately. She stared at the updated listing, suspicion flaring. She recognized restraint when she saw it now. That night, she stood on the balcony, city lights flickering below. She felt the presence she had tried to ignore pressing closer, not invasive, not controlling, but undeniably there. "You're interfering," she murmured into the dark, though no one stood beside her. Miles away, Nathaniel Blackwood looked out over the same city, knowing she would feel it. "Yes," he said softly, "but only where the line bends into harm." Grace didn't know what unsettled her more, that someone had stepped in without being asked, or that a part of her was relieved. She was standing on the edge now, of losing everything, of accepting help she had sworn never to take. And somewhere between resistance and survival, Grace Mitchell was running out of room to remain untouched. Grace knew she was nearing the end of something long before she understood what waited beyond it. The apartment no longer felt like a battlefield, nor a refuge. It had become a threshold. Boxes lined one wall, half-packed, tentative as if the decision to leave had been made by her hands, but not yet accepted by her heart. The city outside pressed in with its usual indifference, but the weight she felt now came from within. She had fought hard to stand alone, harder than anyone knew. And yet, the truth she could no longer deny was this: standing alone was beginning to cost more than she could justify. The revised offer on the apartment still sat unread on her screen. Better terms? More time? No urgency. No pressure. Grace recognized the shape of restraint now, even when it arrived disguised as mercy. It carried the same signature she had begun to sense everywhere: subtle, controlled, deliberate. Nathaniel Blackwood. She had not thanked him. She had not confronted him either. Pride and caution held her in equal measure, but something had shifted since the night on the balcony, when she had spoken into the dark and known without proof that she was heard. Grace met him again a week later, not by invitation, not by coincidence, by choice. She sent a single message to the same unmarked contact. One conversation. In public. The reply came quickly. Of course. They met in a quiet cafe overlooking the river, a place where power blended easily with anonymity. Nathaniel arrived first, seated where he could see the entrance without appearing to watch it. When Grace approached, he rose not out of courtesy, but acknowledgement. "You came," he said. "So did you," Grace replied. They sat across from each other, the space between them measured and intentional. For a long moment, neither spoke. The river moved steadily beyond the glass, indifferent to the careful recalibration unfolding at the table. "You're preparing to leave," Nathaniel said at last. Grace did not bother denying it. "I'm preparing to survive. Those are not always the same thing." Grace met his gaze. "They are when the world keeps reminding you that you don't belong." Nathaniel's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "You belong exactly where you choose to stand, not when standing costs everyone around you," she said softly. He considered that. "You're thinking of your brother." "Yes, and you believe accepting help makes you weak. I believe it makes me owned." The word settled between them, heavy and honest. Nathaniel leaned back slightly. "I don't want to own you." Grace studied him, searching for deception. She found none, only restraint, honed sharp enough to feel like truth. "Then why are you still here?" "Because you're not asking for rescue," he replied. "You're asking for room." Grace's breath caught. "And you think you can give that I already have," he said quietly. "You just don't trust it yet." Silence stretched, not tense, but fragile. Grace felt the edges of her resistance beginning to soften, not collapse, not surrender, but bend. She had spent so long bracing herself against the world that she had forgotten what it felt like to be met rather than pushed. "I won't be part of your world," she said finally. Nathaniel nodded. "I know. And I won't trade my independence for comfort. I wouldn't respect you if you did." The admission surprised them both. Grace smiled faintly despite herself. "Then what is this?" Nathaniel's gaze held hers, steady and unguarded. A negotiation between equals. The word sent a quiet thrill through her, not romantic. Not yet, but deeply intimate in its own way. She had never been anyone's equal in rooms like this. They spoke then, carefully, about boundaries, about Noah, about what Grace needed to rebuild without erasing herself. Nathaniel did not offer solutions, only options. He did not demand proximity, only honesty. Each exchange peeled back a layer of caution, revealing something unexpectedly gentle beneath the steel. When they stood to leave, Grace felt lighter, not because her problems had vanished, but because she no longer felt like she was carrying them unseen. Outside, the afternoon light softened the river into something almost forgiving. "I don't know where this leads," Grace said. Nathaniel held her gaze. "Neither do I. That bothers you?" "It should," he replied. "But it doesn't." Grace laughed softly, surprised by the sound. "You're dangerous." "Yes," Nathaniel agreed, "but not to you." She believed him. That night, Grace returned home and sat beside Noah at the kitchen table. She told him the truth, not all of it, but enough. "I'm not disappearing," she said, "and I'm not selling the apartment. Not yet." Noah searched her face. What changed? Grace thought of the river, the cafe, the man who had learned how to wait. "I realize that choosing support doesn't mean surrendering myself." Noah smiled. "I always knew you'd figure it out." Grace went to bed that night without fear gnawing at her chest. The city still loomed. The future remained uncertain. But for the first time since Monarch, she felt something steadier than resolve taking root. Hope not loud, not reckless, but earned. And somewhere across the city, Nathaniel Blackwood stood by his window once more, watching lights flicker on as evening fell. He did not think of control. He did not think of power. He thought of a woman who had stood still once and forced the world to adjust. The ending had not arrived yet, but the ground beneath it was finally set. The city changed quietly, the way it always did when something permanent was taking root beneath the noise. Grace noticed it in small things. First, the way mornings no longer felt like negotiations with fear. The way the apartment held warmth instead of tension. The way Noah laughed more easily now that uncertainty no longer hovered over every plan. She had not moved out. She had not stayed exactly the same either. The space around her life had widened. Nathaniel did not insert himself into her days. He did not appear unannounced or reshape her routines. His presence existed with intention, never assumption. Some evenings they shared silence over dinner, Others, they spoke for hours about ideas, ethics, the strange arithmetic of power and choice. Grace learned that beneath his controlled exterior lived a man who questioned himself constantly, who carried responsibility like a second spine. Affection grew not as an explosion, but as a convergence. The moment Grace understood this came on a rainy night, weeks after their conversation by the river. She had received a call from a former colleague, voice tight with panic, a legal dispute, a threat disguised as procedure, the kind of problem that devoured people who faced it alone. Grace listened, heart steady. When the call ended, she did not spiral. She did not brace for impact. She simply stood, took a breath, and sent one message. I need clarity, not protection. Nathaniel arrived an hour later, soaked rain-dark at the edges, calm at the center. He listened without interrupting, asked precise questions, and laid out options with ruthless fairness. He did not promise victory. He promised transparency. When it was over, Grace looked at him and felt something settle into certainty. You didn't take over. She said, I wouldn't, he replied. You could have. Yes. The admission carried no pride, only trust. She stepped closer, rain-scented air between them. Then this is real. Nathaniel's expression shifted, softened, not weakened. It has been for a while. Grace kissed him then, slow and deliberate, not as surrender, but as choice. It was not dramatic. It was precise, the kind of kiss that did not erase the world, but aligned it. From that night forward, their relationship unfolded without secrecy, not because Nathaniel had none, but because Grace refused to be hidden. She met his world on her terms, attending events as an equal, never an accessory. When others tried to categorize her, Nathaniel corrected them with quiet finality. This is Grace, he would say. She stands with me, not behind, not beneath. The final test came unexpectedly. A deal Nathaniel had been negotiating collapsed under ethical scrutiny, one he could have salvaged with pressure. Leverage, silence. The old systems waited for him to choose efficiency over conscience. Grace did not advise him. She did not need to. Nathaniel walked away. The decision cost him influence in certain circles, accelerated a transformation he had long resisted. When the fallout came, he faced it openly, restructuring alliances, rebuilding trust with transparency rather than fear. Grace watched him through it all, not with concern, but with recognition. This was the man he had been becoming long before she arrived. The night the dust finally settled, they stood on the balcony together, the city glowing below like a living constellation. You changed things, Grace said quietly. Nathaniel shook his head. You reminded me why they needed to change. She turned to him, studying the lines of his face, the man who no longer hid behind inevitability. Do you regret it? Not for a second, he replied. Power that costs your future isn't power. It's delay. Grace smiled. You sound lighter. I am. Months passed. Noah moved into his own place nearby, thriving, independent, proud. Grace expanded her work, took on projects that mattered, refused those that didn't. She no longer negotiated her worth. One evening, Nathaniel invited her back to the river cafe where everything had shifted. Are we negotiating again? Grace teased. Yes, he said, smiling. But the terms are simple. He did not kneel. He did not present spectacle. He placed a small box on the table between them, untouched until Grace reached for it. This isn't ownership, he said. It's alignment. Two trajectories choosing the same horizon. Grace opened the box, heart steady, eyes bright. I was never going to disappear. I know, Nathaniel replied. That's why I want to walk beside you. She slipped the ring onto her finger, not as an ending, but as continuation. Outside, the river flowed on, unconcerned with conclusions. But for Grace and Nathaniel, the future no longer felt like a battleground or a gamble. It felt like a shared direction. The city did not bow. The world did not soften. But together, they had learned something rare and unbreakable. Love was not the loss of power. It was the place where power finally learned how to rest.